Perfect, thanks.
And then I'll probably have my counterpart, Dalen Tidwell, kind of help me with that. So can kind of transition over to that because that's his area, if that's okay.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay,
Looks like
perfect.
we're back on again.
Okay.
Looks like we might be live again. And I wonder, Charlie, if you're able to record this through being a host, and that if that comes up again, that we just record from here, and if it gets hacked again, we can post the Zoom recording later. Charlie, did you hear that? You're on mute. Maybe he's talking to Missy.
Yeah, I can hear you, just so you know.
Thanks, Brett.
Hey gang, so let's Missy and Pat are getting this fixed. It sounds like about a minute or so and we should be back up.
Thanks, Dylan.
Hey, Heather, can I make a comment real quick?
Absolutely, Darren.
This is Darren. Hey, just to the committee and all the support people, I'm going to make a quick introduction that Dr. Jared Beaver, who works with me at Montana State University, is the new Wildlife Ag Interactions Extension Specialist, and he's tuning in and listening to the committees, and just somebody that's going to be working on the front with wildlife ag issues for Montana State University Extension and just thought that he'd be a resource, and as we go through that again, he's going to be listening with. And so thanks everybody and welcome.
Thanks, Darren.
Darren, what was his name again?
Dr. Jared Beaver.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So he's going to brand new faculty member just on staff, and that'll be his charge, is to try and work in this field and that. And if you kind of picture back maybe 4 or 5 years, some of you may remember Dr. Jim Knight, and that's the position he's filling on that. So excited to have him back at Montana State University. It's a needed position. So didn't want to hijack this thing, but in the interim, I figured I'd make introductions.
Sounds
Excellent.
like a great addition. Thanks.
Okay, gang, so it sounds like you guys are back live. I guess we can just pick back up, and maybe Heather, if you don't mind, kind of putting the viewers into context what we've been dealing with, and then Ken can restart, and Missy and Pat are kind of monitoring to make sure we're good to go.
Thanks, Dylan. I appreciate it. So to the public, again, apologies for the technical difficulties. We put our presentation on hold, so you haven't missed any discussion. We've just been waiting for Missy and Pat to get this back up. So thanks to the two of you for continuing to monitor and help us with the technical difficulties. So again, we've got Ken McDonald from Montana Fish Wildlife Parks doing a presentation, and his presentation you can follow along on the role and structure of hunting, the FWP summary, which is the third document from the bottom up on the website. So Ken, I'll turn it back over to you.
Hey.
And if you want to just let people know what slide you're on.
All right, I'm on slide 8. We were just talking about, how we calculate available mortalities to ensure that we stay within our population management guidelines. And the example on that page 8 was based on the population size, the estimated population size, and the allowable mortality. We had a total of 50 males and 22 females would be the maximum mortality. The mortalities that previous year were 33 males. 50 minus 33 means there's 17, and there is 2.5 females that potentially could be available for hunting. And again, from a biological standpoint, hunting mortalities are no different than a train mortality or a one removed for taking livestock or a management purpose or any other type of mortality. So that's one of the kind of the main things we wanted to get across. The other thing is under this model, and it'll be the same kind of for the NCDE, is if we were to trap and transplant animals, those would also be viewed as a mortality because they're removed from they're removed from the population. So again, anything that removes an animal from the population is treated as a mortality. So going to page 9, what we said as states with this tri-state MOA is that we all agreed that was to the maximum amount of mortality, and then we could work on how that gets divvied out if there was a need to. The default otherwise would be that mortality is based on the percent of the geographic area of each state within the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So using that, it's 34% Montana, 58% Wyoming, 8% Idaho, which means if you go to the next slide, page 10, you can see all these numbers kind of broken out. There's the population estimate on the top row. If you go to the right, based on an estimate, there's the mortality thresholds for males and females. You go to the middle left, you can see what the total mortality, the known and estimated mortality was, what would be available for hunting. And then if you divvied it up based on that proportion of geography, how would that work out. So if we would have had a hunting season, if bears would not have been relisted in 2018, there could have been a potential hunting season of just basically 6 or 7 bears in Montana, just 6 males, 1 female, if you round up. So that's, if there was a hunting season, that would be the maximum hunting mortality that would be allowed in Montana, and then the other 2 states to make sure that we stayed within the thresholds. Real quick, just because I'm on that page, one of the other things we hear a lot is you guys just want to have hunting season so you can sell a bunch of licenses. And one of our recommendations in our hunting proposal was we would only have the number of licenses available as there would be bears. So if we had a hunting season that maximized that available mortality and had 6 or 7 licenses available, a resident grizzly bear license is $150, so that would raise about $1,000. If you recall from the last meeting in Libby, our expenditures on grizzly bears about 1.3 million. So hunting isn't even put a dent in the revenues needed to manage grizzly bears. So anyway, that's how we kind of got to at a population level how hunting would be managed to ensure mortality doesn't exceed the agreed upon and the federal requirements. Then we worked on how would it happen in Montana. So again, we put together a hunting season framework. There's a requirement for delisting. The framework doesn't include numbers or quotas, and that again is going to be based on an annual look at based on the known and estimated mortalities and the population size. And then that would all have to go before the commission each year, where the commission would determine, what the numbers and quotas are, as well as any changes of the structure. If you recall, in 2018, while they were still delisted, we did take a proposal, or we did visit with the commission about hunting. The recommendation and the ultimate decision by the commission was that Montana would not have a hunting season that first year, even though we could have had 6 or 7 licenses if we wanted. So again, the commission is one of the steps in all of this, and the commission's one of their main jobs is the public process, the public comment, and incorporating some of the public values into the decision making. So turning to page 12, that's just a copy of the cover of the regulations that we did take to the commission and that they approved. That's that framework. I think you guys all had availability of that after your first meeting, and it's probably still on the website. But real quick, just to go through it, again, for Montana, and this is how we would have managed had we proceeded with hunting. We first developed guiding principles. So guiding principles are maintain a viable grizzly bear population in the Yellowstone under state management. And I'm on slide 13. Increase broad public acceptance of sustainable harvest and hunter opportunity as an effective part of successful long-term bear conservation, and maintain a positive and effective relationships with stakeholders. So that was sort of the guiding principles for going into the development of the hunting season structure. And then based on that, we came up with the proposed framework the commission adopted, and it was very conservative. And that's a point I really want to stress. It was very conservative to make sure that we did not exceed any of those mortality limits had we had a hunting season. So it starts out with the actual estimator is real conservative. Mark Haraldson's talked about that, and it's probably underestimates the population by a considerable 20, 30, 40%. So we're starting with a conservative estimate. Then we take into account all sources of mortality from throughout the ecosystem before we even look at what's left for hunting. For Montana, we proposed a quota-based system, which means hunting, would there be, in this example that I used, using those numbers, say a quota not to exceed 6 males. And then that would be spread out between hunting districts. If we hit the quota, the season would close. And in this case, we also limited the number of licenses equal to the quota, or the number of bears available. So if there were 6 bears available, we would only sell 6 licenses. We would never therefore exceed the mortality limits. And then we had real conservative season dates. And I've got a graph later on here that talks about it'd be early in the spring and late in the fall, when bears are mainly male bears are more likely to be out. Females, and particularly females with cubs, are less likely to be out, so less likely to be taken either directly or accidentally during a hunting season. Turning the page, slide 15. We divided the delisted portion of the range into bear management units. And what we did is we incorporated portions of what was in the demographic monitoring area and out of the demographic monitored area into these management units, and applied the limits to that whole area. So theoretically, all those numbers I just talked about only apply to within the demographic monitoring area. And outside of that, again, we could do whatever we wanted, that we're not limited by those mortality thresholds. But we decided we would incorporate both parts, the bears in the area and outside the area, and apply the limits to that total area in order to, again, make sure we're not creating a sort of 2 different management scenarios, one inside and one outside. What applies to the whole area. We said female quota would apply to all units, and then we'd have male sub quotas in individual units. And basically that's because the female quota is so small that if you took the one female, everything would shut down for females. The males, the idea is you wouldn't take all of them in one area. Season dates, again, you can see March 15th to April 20th, and fall November 10th to December 15th. If you skip ahead a couple slides, there's a graph that shows den emergence, and you can see when males and female, or this is males, females, and females with cubs are coming out. On that second week in March, when we propose an opener, there's literally no females out, and they're just starting to come out, and females with cubs aren't going to come out till that's almost done. And by the time that spring season ended, still more than half the females are in the den. So this would be a conservative effort to kind of focus more on the males than the females. And the slide after that is just the opposite, showing den going back into the dens. Same thing, the females go in first, males later. So the season structure was based on trying to focus more on the male component of the population. So one point with that I just wanted to bring up, because there's been some talk about we could use hunting as a way to address conflicts. If you really look at when most of the conflicts occur versus when these seasons occur, it's probably, there's probably a limited opportunity for hunting to address conflicts directly. So say, for example, there was a livestock depredation in June, we wouldn't have a season where we could direct a hunter to go potentially take a bear that's involved with that livestock depredation. And for the most part, we probably don't want to try and go there, just mainly because if we're dealing with a livestock depredation or a human safety issue, we need the professionals like the wildlife services guys to get in there and take care of it, and not rely on a hunter to maybe or maybe not take care of it. And so hunting probably will not do a lot, at least as we've designed it here, will not do a lot to address conflicts directly. The other thing we have a concern about is just fair chase. For example, you have a bear hanging out in a garbage dumpster. Having somebody go shoot a bear coming out of a garbage dumpster really wouldn't be a fair chase vision. And so we're real cognizant of that as well. So turning the page, next slide, just shows a map of, again, this was Yellowstone, the hunting districts. You can see on that table, the one to the left or the west, the hunting district 300, we would propose that would be closed. And the district on east 501, we also proposed as closed, as those are likely corridors for connectivity. So we did take into account connectivity. The other 301, 2, 3, 4, and then 500, if we were to do a hunting season, numbers would be, those tables would be populated. And again, some of those could also be closed depending on kind of what the population's doing, where the issues are, and where managers feel there's some ability and opportunity to hunt bears. So I'm going to skip now the two graphs. I think those made sense. If you have questions, you can ask real quick. And then just some of the other things we included in the framework. There's a 12-hour reporting requirement. So anybody that takes a bear has to report it within 12 hours. If that resulted in a quota being reached, we would close that area within 24 hours. We would have a mandatory orientation to talk about not only bear identification, but also some of the social issues around bears, and making sure that hunters are cognizant of they're being watched, and everybody's tracking this. A number of licenses equals number of bears. So again, we wouldn't exceed the mortality, and no taking of bears accompanied by other bears. This last one's kind of interesting. We spent a lot of time on how do you word that. I think in our black bear regulations, it's no taking of bears accompanied by young. But grizzly bears, particularly a mom with 2-year-old cubs, the cubs are often, fairly good sized. And so instead of saying bears accompanied by young or bears accompanied by cubs, we just said no taking of bears accompanied by other bears, to make sure there's no confusion on what that means. And that's pretty much it. So the again, this structure was adopted by our commission. Bears, while they were delisted, the commission, at least for the first year, said we weren't going to hunt them. Subsequent years are now kind of moot because they're listed again. If they were delisted, we would probably start with this framework. And again, whether to have a season or not have a season is an issue that would be heard by the commission and decided by the commission. In the NCDE, it's a similar concept where we have some mortality limits. There's some differences in how the numbers are worked out that Cecily worked on. But it's the same concept where you have mortality limits, you would have potential mortality or potential availability of hunting if you're within those mortality limits. And ultimately, whether that happens or not would be up to the commission and based on the public comment and what they hear. So that's what I have. If there's any questions, I'm happy to try and answer.
Thanks, Ken. We'll, given just time and the technical difficulties that we've experienced, we'll get through the presenters. It was a really helpful overview in terms of mortality limits and how a hunting season would be structured and what would be entailed. And so, again, apologies to the public for the technical difficulties. Ken McDonald's presentation is on the website on the Grizzly Bear Advisory Council page. His presentation was the third from the bottom, the role and structure of hunting, the FWP summary. And then again, the support team did create a briefing that also provides a bit more detail, but still high level summary on the role of hunting in grizzly bear management. So thanks, Ken, for that thoughtful presentation. We'll move next to Garth Moat, is from British Columbia. He's a wildlife biologist and has lived in Nelson since 1996. He's the provincial large carnivore specialist with the BC Ministry of Forest, Lands, Natural Resource Operational and Rural Development. He's also an adjunct professor at Okanagan in Kelowna. I don't know that I said that right, but Garth, you can totally correct me on that. He's studied in carnivore and ungulate population biology throughout his career and is focused on grizzly bear ecology over the last 2 decades. So Garth's presentation is the 6th document listed on the website. It's titled History of Grizzly Bear Management in British Columbia for the public to access and follow along. So Garth, I'll encourage you to just keep people apprised of which slide you're on as you're doing your presentation. And if you could also turn your video on, that would be great.
Okay. Heather, I think I have my video on now. Do you?
Yep, I see you. Great.
And can you hear me?
I can hear you as well. Yeah.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. I hope I can add some sort of a perspective, I guess a northern perspective, although I'm in southern Canada, but a northern perspective to what you're talking about today. I'm just going to go to slide 2. The history of large carnivore management in British Columbia is very similar to Montana or anywhere in the northwest of the lower 48 states. There was a continued population declines from at least the early 1900s and probably well before that to the 1960s or 70s. After World War II, Canada had a huge aircraft fleet, and there was broadcast poisoning for wolves in the 50s and early 60s, and that probably reduced bear populations even into the backcountry as well. There was a lot of baited sites, even in northern British Columbia. And so somewhere around the 1970s or 80s, we probably had the lowest populations of grizzly bears, wolves, cougars, wolverine. And at that point, things started to change. The management of grizzly bears became more intense. They were managed as varmints actually up until the 70s, which put very little restriction on the killing of them. And then we moved to a point where in the early 1990s, the hunting of grizzly bears was managed entirely on quota across the entire province. From the 1970s to somewhere in the 2000s, the population of grizzly bears in British Columbia increased continuously for about 30 years. Somewhere in the middle 2000s, the population started to level off, and we've actually had a number of local populations decline and then go up. And so I guess I would say to you that right now, the continuous grizzly bear population in British Columbia is fluctuating around its carrying capacity. It's no longer recovering. It is being limited by the limiting factors that typically limit grizzly bear populations. And so if you go to slide number 3, if you're following along the slides, what you see in that slide is the listing the international perspective on the conservation threats to grizzly bears in British Columbia. Those red dots on the left are 2 populations, the North Cascade population. A number of you people have heard about that. That's the southern red blob there. There's virtually no grizzly bears in that population. It's completely isolated. We've had virtually no animals move into that area. And the other 2 populations nearby are also very isolated by either the Fraser River or a barrier to the north. Those populations will not recover on their own. The other populations closer to Montana, the Cabinet Yak population in yellow, we call it the Yak because we don't have the cabinet, we're not part of the cabinets, but the cabinets are not part of BC. And then the next, the South Selkirk population in, sorry, I got it backwards. In yellow, on the yellow one is the South Selkirk population. And then the Yak population is shown in orange there, the northern blob that comes into BC. That population is listed as endangered federally or internationally, and the Selkirk's population is listed as vulnerable. In 1970, the grizzly bear populations in British Columbia that were continuous with the United States is 1 population in the Flathead Valley in Montana and 1 population in the South Selkirk mountain range that went into Idaho. From there west all the way to the coast to Vancouver, there were no grizzly bear populations along the 49th parallel. There was just those 2 populations in about 1970. That you can see the range where they are occupying now, it's much larger. If you go to the next slide, where are my numbers? Slide 4. This is just a cumulative effects analysis for grizzly bears for the province. This is meant for local managers to get an idea for what's causing threats to individual grizzly bear populations. You'll see along the boundary, they're all orange there, meaning they're high, the risk is high. It's actually, they call it the hazard is high, but the threats to the populations in the south are higher. That's common for many species in British Columbia. Almost everybody in British Columbia lives in the lower third of the province. There's 5 million people in British Columbia, and they virtually all live in the lower third of the province. The northern half of the province is bigger than Montana, probably a little bit, a third bigger than Montana, and there's only about 30,000 people in the northern half of the province. So it's the population density is extremely varied from north to south in BC. It declines dramatically as you go from north to south. The threats to grizzly bears in British Columbia are 1, isolation, as we talked about. Those are those red, the extreme blobs, the red blobs in the west there, that surround basically the city of Vancouver. Isolation is a main threat. Mortality is a threat in a number of areas. The Cabinet Yak unit, one of the women that introduced herself earlier this morning, lives in the Cabinet Yak unit. That unit, we have perpetual ongoing non-hunting mortality problems, and that's probably the largest single threat to that population, certainly on our side of the boundary anyway. And then the other bigger, more insidious problem is road densities. It's a very general threat. It's just road densities. And many of those orange blobs are showing as orange because of road density, very high road density, which results from industrial forestry. So typical of our narrow-minded perspective that we often have, I didn't show part of the US on this because there's a BC analysis, but the population in the very south lower right-hand corner of the province, very southeast part of the province, is the Flathead population, which connects down into the Flathead Valley. in Montana, just for perspective there. I went through Heather, you sent me a couple of documents around what the committee had been briefed on earlier, and I went through there and plucked out questions. So I'm not going to go through all of my responses to those questions, but I was sitting in a particularly boring meeting the day after I talked to Heather, and I pulled these things out. So my next group of slides are just going through the documents that you already had as a committee and looking at the questions there and asking what I could add to them. So I'm just going to go through those briefly. There's probably more written than I'll say, but you can ask after if you're interested. In the grizzly bear hunt in British Columbia has been extremely controversial as long as I've been managing bears, which is since the mid-90s. It has been turned off twice by left-wing governments in British Columbia. And in 2018, it was halted permanently by a new left-wing government that we had. So we have not had a grizzly bear hunt for 2 years now. The hunt was extremely tightly controlled. It was by far and away the most managed and intensively managed hunt that we had in British Columbia, to the point that some of the managers got tired of the paperwork, not the paperwork, the fiddling involved in calculating quotas and tags for grizzly bears. It was quite a bit of work. We also had two sectors of hunters in British Columbia. We had the resident hunters who were regulated by a draw system, and then we had guide outfitters who brought in international hunters, and they were regulated by a quota system. The system that we used to regulate hunting was not very different from what Ken just talked about. There are many similarities between what the regulation and the logic that Ken just talked about to you now and the way that we manage them in British Columbia as well. The only difference is the area was much bigger. We had a grizzly bear hunt over about 2/3 of the province of British Columbia. There's about 15,000 grizzly bears in British Columbia, to give you a perspective. So once the hunt was shut down, we had this question regularly. I liked some of the questions that you had in your literature because they were the same questions we got asked. For example, when the hunt was shut down in BC, what are we going to do? We're going to be overrun with grizzly bears. People are going to be killed anywhere and everywhere wherever they go in the backcountry. And the reality is we never changed anything about how we manage human grizzly bear conflict after they closed the hunt. And we have had no crises. So, and in fact, I would say that the way that you manage human conflict is different than the way you manage a hunt. And they're not even the same bears most of the time. So we didn't do anything when we shut the hunt down. And the world has not fallen apart. We have had no more attacks, or nobody's been killed or anything terrible like that. We did not change the conflict rules for our conservation officers. We have a matrix about what how do we respond to certain conflict situations. We never changed those strike rules or anything. So that's a pretty easy answer to that. The hunting regime, I looked through what was sent to me, and I'm just going to skip over this. The only one thing I would add is that one thing that we learned in BC when we were managing grizzly bears was, for the longest time, we just assumed the bear populations were increasing and that bear populations either were level or were increasing. And so we had a very static system of calculating tags and quotas. When we got to the 2000s, we started to realize that, wow, they actually go up and down like elk and moose and deer, and we better pay a bit more attention to what happens when they go up and down, especially when they go down, because they go down for reasons that have nothing to do with the hunt. The hunt doesn't control the number of bears in the landscape at all. But when they go down, you have to be aware of that and account for that in your hunting. Is hunting sustainable? We've been drugged through every ditch and mud puddle that you can imagine in British Columbia about the sustainability of hunting, from questioning the methods we use to count bears, to calculate quotas, the way we decided which portions of the population would be hunted, etc. The answer is hunting is sustainable, at least the way that we did it. And we managed grizzly bear hunting very conservatively. the maximum mortality rate for in any area was 6%, and the average mortality rate was around 2%, including non-human mortality. So we had very low mortality rates across the province. And there's been many examples where bear hunts have been managed sustainably around the world, not just in North America, but around the world. And so I don't think that that is a very useful thing to get hung up on. Oh, is it possible to manage hunting sustainably for bears? The answer is yes, it is. You have to do it right, but it can be done. There's another question about, does hunting regulate bear populations? We had a huge round of articles in a number of the big newspapers in Vancouver and Victoria and the Lower Mainland, where all the people live in British Columbia. 4 of the 5 million people live down there in a very small corner of the province. About when we stop the hunt, we're no longer managing the population, and it was difficult for us as wildlife managers to explain to the general public that we don't actually manage populations. The hunt is, people had it in their mind that, oh, we had a hunt there, and that's because we had a target population. We were controlling that population to some number that was some divine number. And and some managers don't necessarily like you to say that we're not doing that, because there was this impression that we had control over the world. The reality is we killed 2% of the grizzly bear population per year. It never had any effect on the population size. The reproductive potential has far exceeded the 2%. So by the next year, the population was back to the size that it was the year before. So we were not managing the population size in any number. And that's true for most hunts that I've seen. When you look at the data on mule deer numbers and how they go up and down over a period of 20 years or so, there's a lot more going on there than just the hunt. I don't think that we actually, in hunting, regulate populations near as much as we think we do, or more dangerously in some ways, the way the public thinks that we're managing numbers of animals to some, like I say, divine number. In British Columbia now, our bear populations are limited by isolation in 3 cases. They're limited by human-caused mortality in about 3 or 4 others, maybe 5 if you want to be really, really uncertain and include all uncertainties. And the rest of the populations are regulated by food. And in a lot of cases in the interior, that's berries and 1 or 2 or 3 species of berries. And on the coast, it's salmon, and our salmon populations are declining up and down the entire coast. And so the greatest limiting factor for about 1/3 of our grizzly bears is salmon declines. Does hunting reduce conflict with grizzly bears? Ken just talked about that. And that thing that Mike Medell sent, or well, Heather, that you sent me, that Mike Medell wrote the other day, talked about conflict. And in that hunt that Montana State had in the 90s, they actually had a hunt where it looked to me like the hunters were confined to hunting on private land. And it seemed like they were focusing hunters on trying to hunt bears at low elevations that might have been in conflict before. We would not be able to do that in British Columbia. 97% of British Columbia is Crown land, that is, it's public land. We have very little private land ownership in Canada. And where a hunter could hunt comfortably, safely, would largely exclude him or her hunting a conflict grizzly bear. Our conflicts are less with the ranching community, especially in the last 10 or 20 years, because they're changing their practices in ranching areas. We've never had compensation for predation on cattle in British Columbia. Our ranchers have had to learn how to manage their livestock based on their own husbandry practices to live with and make a living in grizzly bear occupied areas. So our conflicts with grizzly bears tend to be instantaneous conflicts with, sound charging a hunter or hiker or whatever, or in things like chicken coops or pig pens, or much more suburban or ex-urban areas where we would never have and never encourage a hunter to operate. So I think we've never said that hunting was a way to reduce conflict. For one, like I said, you're removing a few percent of the grizzly bears a year, so you're not reducing the density of grizzly bear populations by hunting, and you're probably not targeting the animals that are getting in conflict. Most hunters are going out to hunt grizzly bears want to go into a wilderness area, because part of the aesthetic of the hunt is to go into a beautiful area. It's not to hunt in somebody's backyard or on a pig farm. So I think, and by the reverse of that is, if you want to manage bears' conflict with people, you have to have programs that do that. You cannot rely on a hunt. That's just a losing venture in my mind.
So Garth, just while you take a pause, I just want to reference the paper that I sent you from Mike Medell that you just referenced is on the GBAC website, the council website. It's the one titled Rocky Mountain Front Grizzly Bear Management Progress Report, dated 1991 to 1994, so that the public can see that they have access to that document as well.
I should have said that I'm on slide 9. I'm very sorry. I've been very poor at telling you what slide number I'm on. I'm on slide 9. There's one more subtlety about conflict that I wanted to mention, and that is that there's no small amount of conflict is also a decision by a bear. Bears know when they're in risky areas. And the example I would use to you is that our officers commonly kill bears that are over 24 years old. Those bears, and both males and females, those bears, and they have had no conflict history in their lives. For a grizzly bear to live to 25 years old is a fairly rare event. And then why would all of a sudden at that age it decide to go and get in a conflict with a bear with a human, when it's obviously had it's been very careful about not getting into conflicts for the past quarter of a century. My point is that those bears probably know they're taking risks, but they're getting old and they're unable to eat properly and catch food or find food or chew food. Most of them the males have virtually no teeth by that point. They're probably driven there by lack of food. And the other example I can present to you is on the coast, where we have major declines in salmon numbers right now. We have unprecedented levels of conflict with grizzly bears in coastal British Columbia. And that, I think, is also driven by the fact that they just don't have any food, and they know they're going into conflict areas, but they're just forced there by the lack of food. Does hunting increase social tolerance of bears? This is slide 10. That one, I think that's an interesting question, and I don't know that's come up a lot in the debate in British Columbia. There's the debate in British Columbia is across the entire diaspora of the province, from the most urban city dwellers to rural areas, across all of the various cultures and communities. But this one was less talked about. I'm not sure whether hunting increases social tolerance. I'm not sure. I know in British Columbia, I was surprised. I still can't believe this. I just looked this up while Ken was talking. There's only 130,000 people in Montana. Is that possible? How many people live in Montana?
I think we're closer to around 1 million.
Okay, because the website I hit had 130,000. I was just shaking my head thinking, it's impossible. But in British Columbia, there's about 5 million people. My point was, hunters are a very small part of the people of British Columbia.
1,130,000.
Sorry?
1,130,000.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Chuck.
That's my eyesight failing. So the hunters are about 3% of the population in British Columbia. And I do know that when we've had these debates about should we hunt grizzly bears or should we not hunt grizzly bears, I've been surprised by how split the hunting community is as well. There were quite a few hunters who were indifferent to whether they were closed because they said quite openly that, well, I'll never hunt grizzly bears, so I don't care. And others who were opposed to the hunt, other hunters, only a small portion. So I don't know how much you change the tolerance of society by having a hunt or not. I don't know. That's something I really don't know. It's a very interesting question.
Garth, there's a question that's come in, and so while you're talking about social tolerance, it would be helpful if you could give us a summary of the primary ecosystem type in BC and what percentage of industry is agriculture, and sort of help frame that a bit.
Wow. Might it be better if I do, let's speak about the area close that borders on Montana. So the portion of British Columbia that borders on Montana, if we include Alberta, Alberta's by far away the most agricultural. As you move from east to west through Alberta into what's the Kootenay region of British Columbia where I live, my research study is in the Flathead Valley, so the very southeast corner, through to the Okanagan Valley. We go from dryland farming, which is mainly grain farming in south central Alberta, to livestock raising in the Rocky Mountain east slopes, livestock raising again when you go to the Rocky Mountain west slopes, and then you move all the way to the Okanagan Valley, which is basically north of Spokane, Washington, and that is largely fruit crops, which traditionally was apples and fruit. Now it's, of course, half of it's wine, I would say, or it looks to me like half of the Okanagan Valley is planted in wine now, and grapes now. But so so agriculture is an important part of the landscape in that southern part of British Columbia, but the majority of British Columbia, it isn't. It's a forestry dominated industry in the backcountries. I don't know if that helps. Did that help does that answer the question?
There's some chat going on. Trina, is there more that you want to ask or say around that, or Sarah? Because I think that perspective would be helpful in terms of landscape.
I'm just taking this info from the BC Cattlemen's website.
Did you reference that info, Trina?
Yeah, it's www.cattlemen.bc.ca.
Mm-hmm.
And that is their Cattlemen's Association website, and that's where I'm getting all these stats from.
So the stats that you're sharing is that there's about 4,000 cattle ranches in BC. The ranches occupy over 5 million acres of private land and another 21.5 million acres of crown land, with about 610,000 total head of cattle, including dairy. And so I'm imagining the direction that that's going is, what kind of conflict is happening amongst the ranching community.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Heather, I was just going, I've been to Nelson and a little bit of that area, and the ecosystem type reminds me much more of the Northwest Montana type. And so in referencing Mike Madel's paper on the front with private land hunting versus, just kind of getting a frame of reference for what it would be like to hunt in a spruce fir type ecosystem with very little open prairie habitat versus kind of the eastern front, trying to give people a reference to maybe some of the differences. And as Trina mentioned, I don't know that they have a lot of large scale cattle ranching while they have other type of agriculture.
Thanks, Sarah. And I think, Kristen just made another point on chat indicating, and for comparison, that the Blackfeet Reservation is about 1.5 million acres. And so just in terms of scale. So sorry, Garth, wanting to just sort of give perspective for comparisons and conversation.
The most of the range of grizzly bears in British Columbia is in a forested ecosystem. We do have 2 valleys that are largely non-forested, and those valleys are where the majority of our cattle ranching is. And the Okanagan Valley is one of them that's been unoccupied by grizzly bears for probably 100 years now. And the other one is the Columbia Trench, so that's going north of Libby. And that area is intensively ranched and farmed, and it's rare that we have grizzly bears down in the trench, as we call it. So that's correct. That there's not really very many places, I think, that would be like the Blackfoot Reservation, in the sense that there's bears that spend most of their time in a non-forested environment. There is a fairly large cattle industry in British Columbia, though, and our cattle ranchers have been dealing with grizzly bear conflicts for 100 years or more. And there is a program right now, and you might see that on the website, this LPP, the Livestock Protection Program, where government has actually gone into partnership with the Livestock Association to actually compensate for lost cattle when it's confirmed. This is the first time this has happened in BC. When a livestock can be confirmed killed by a predator. And in fact, the Livestock Association hires their own people to deal with the coyote and wolf problems, because our officers couldn't deal with all of them. So our officers still deal with black bear, cougar, and grizzly bear predation issues, but they don't do wolf and coyote anymore. They have specialists come and do that. So I don't know if that helps, but British Columbia is extremely varied. It has more ecological variation than the rest of Canada combined. So we go from the highest rainfall in North America to some very dry areas in the South Okanagan. So
Thanks. So you've got 2 slides left, it looks like.
And I don't really have a lot to say. The trophy hunters, basically the campaign in British Columbia to close the grizzly bear hunt based it on this trophy hunt. It's a trophy hunt, the trophy bear hunt. And I find that a bit of a misnomer in a way. There are many, many hunts for animals that are trophies. Many people like to catch the biggest fish when they go fishing, and they talk about who caught the biggest fish. And so this idea, there's a trophy component to most hunting, I would say, or many, many hunts. And so the idea that this one is worse, or that the mentality is worse than for a trophy steelhead fishery, which we have many of in British Columbia, I'm not so sure that that's the most relevant thing, but it has certainly been a big driver in British Columbia in people's mentality. The last one, does hunting make bears warier of people? There's been a little bit of research on that lately, and we've had a man who was a professor at University of Calgary who has strongly advocated that if bears are not hunted, they're going to become more dangerous. I don't know. I just don't know. That I think there's no clear answer in my mind. I mean, I've listened to the debates. There's not a lot of data on the debates. We've all seen the fact that in national parks where bears are not hunted, they become more nonchalant around people. That's true on salmon streams. Does that make them more dangerous? I mean, I think, we do know from Steve Herrero and Tom Smith and other people's work that bears that become strongly food conditioned are more dangerous to people, or at some point maybe more dangerous to people, but are warier bears less dangerous to people? In my mind, there's not a clear answer to that. And that's my last slide. So I hope I've touched on some of the things that were of interest to the group here.
Thanks, Garth. That was really helpful, and we will certainly open it up for Q&A with the council here after we've got Larry presenting next. So please stay tuned, and council members, please hold your questions for both Garth and Ken. So we have Larry Vandell, who's our next speaker. He's a member of the Alaska Board of Game, appointed by Governor Walker in 2017. He first came to Alaska in 1997 and started work with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game in 1981, after earning his bachelor's and master's degree in wildlife management. He's had a 34-year career with the Department of Fish and Game, and was a wildlife biologist in Dillingham and in Kodiak, and has also spent time as a regional wildlife biologist and regional supervisor in Alaska. He comes with quite a bit of experience, just as Garth and Ken do. And again, for the public, we've got Larry's notes from his presentation. It's the second from the bottom PDF on the council website, which you can obtain there. So Larry, I'll turn it over to you. And if you could turn your video on.
Video and sound. You have both?
Thank you. Yeah, I can hear you and see you. Thanks.
First and foremost, I want to thank all of you for inviting me to participate in this. It's quite an honor to be amongst all of you, and to grizzly bear management's always going to be controversial. I mean, it's a big critter. There's always going to be a fear factor. There's a real concern about people's livelihoods as well as their safety when you deal with these animals. But it's also an amazing, iconic animal as well, not just for indigenous people, but for other folks, and there are different ways to utilize it. So what I'd like to do this morning in my 15 minutes that I'm allotted to talk about all of Kodiak, or all of Alaska and all of our bears, is just give you an overview of how we do things, the who, what, when, where of how we do things here in Alaska. And everything I say, I'll predicate with, I'm not trying to tell you what to do. That's the last thing I want to do, is be some quote expert coming in and tell you how you should do it in Montana. I'll just express how we've done it in Alaska, how I've seen it evolve over the 40 years I've been involved with bear management here and with my doctorate and so forth. With that being said, it's in our Constitution that we have to brag about Alaska before we start any presentation. So I'll start off by saying, if we took Alaska and split it into 4 different states, each one of those would still be bigger than Montana. So that being said, we're the furthest north state, we're the furthest west state, and we're also the furthest east state, because the Aleutian chain goes past the date line over there. We have the lowest human population, and we have the most grizzly bears. We've got about 30 or 40,000 grizzly bears, or brown/grizzly bears as we call them here in Alaska. That works out to be about 18 people for every grizzly bear that we have around here. If you want to put it in a different perspective, if you look at your densest area for bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem, you have about 13 square miles per bear. Here in my backyard in Kodiak, we've got about 1.3 square miles per bear. So here in Kodiak, there are about 10 times as many bears as there are in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The reason we can have so many bears around here is our habitats are intact. Bears occur just about everywhere in Alaska. There's a few islands in southeast Alaska and on the outer Aleutian chain that don't have the grizzly bears, but for the most part, they occur throughout the state. We have very healthy salmon populations and a large ungulate population, such as moose and caribou. And even Anchorage, which is our largest city, has a healthy bear population right in the middle of it, both black bears and grizzly bears. So here in Alaska, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game is the one who manages all the resident wildlife around here. And the regulations that they abide by and the hunters abide by are created by the Alaska Board of Game. For management purposes, we divide the state into 26 game management units, and many of those are further subdivided into subunits. Our large land managers, such as the federal government, Park Service, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, as well as native corporations, can be more restrictive on their lands, but they don't set the seasons or bag limits. The Board of Game does. Another big difference here in Alaska is we do not have Indian reservation lands. When the pipeline went through in the early 70s, the native folks here in Alaska settled with the state in what was called the Native Claims Settlement Act. And instead of reservations, they formed corporations. And the corporations own land, but it's not any different than land that's owned by a rancher or a forest industry group or something like that down in your country. So we don't have reservations per se. So the what part of this is, what types of bears do we have? Well, as I say, we consider them brown/grizzly bears. The brown bears are the ones that have access to the salmon throughout the summer and other coastal resources like clams and sedge flats and ungulates like moose and caribou, lots of berries, lots of dead marine mammals that wash up. And because of all this food, these bears get to be pretty darn big. And they have higher densities of bears amongst each other, and they're generally more tolerant of bears and people. In other words, it's a lot easier to get along with a bear here in Kodiak than it is up around Denali Park in the interior part of the state. The rest of the bears that don't have access to that and aren't coastal, we refer to them as grizzlies. And these bears are more akin to what you've got in Montana in their size and their demeanor and their population densities and their food habits. Because we have such great areas, because we have diverse types of bears, we also have diverse types of management programs. And our management programs are fluid in the regulations and also in the management programs themselves, because as Garth mentioned, we've got bear populations that fluctuate just like elk or deer populations do, and we try to keep track of that and monitor them the best we can. In addition to those hunting regulations, we also have bear sanctuaries, both federal bear sanctuaries like Denali National Park and Katmai National Park and so forth, but also state managed sanctuaries like McNeil River. And as you do in Montana and as you do in British Columbia, we have a very active education program, because that's the key to living with these critters, is having people understand them more so that they're not just fearful of them. They have a very real feeling of whether they should be scared or not and how to minimize any kind of conflicts when they're out there. If a bear causes a problem with a person, in other words, if a person has to defend their life or property, our regulations allow you to do that. You can kill a bear to defend your life. You can kill a bear to defend certain types of property. Once you kill that bear, you have to report it to the Department of Fish and Game, and you have to surrender the hide and the skull to the department. You can't keep it yourself. As far as compensation programs for livestock, well, we really don't have any here in Alaska. If someone's livestock are killed by a bear or a wolf or something like that, that's just part of living up here, basically. Okay, so the next part of this is why. Why are we managing them? Why do we have the authority to manage them? Well, right in our state constitution, it says that we will manage all wildlife species for a sustained yield. It also says we'll manage them for the maximum benefit of all the people of the state of Alaska. State statutes that are created by our legislature also direct us to manage moose, caribou, and deer populations for human consumption. In other words, these moose, deer, and caribou are our food security. They're our livestock, because we don't have many domestic livestock operations here in Alaska. And many of our residents, I'd have to say most of our residents, rely on wild game for food. So bears as a predator is a very important part of what we deal with here, as well as wolves. Our predator management programs are very limited in scope and duration. And the first step of any of these programs is to liberalize hunting and trapping seasons in the areas where we see moose or caribou or deer populations being suppressed by things other than natural occurrences like food and so forth. If predators are the things that are causing those populations to be depressed, we have state statute says that we have to consider predator management programs. As you can imagine, these programs are really popular among some people and really controversial among other people. It's the nature of the beast. Because of that, the programs are very carefully regulated by the best science we can have. And as I mentioned earlier, they're very limited in scope, both in the area that they are and the time that they're authorized for. They're revisited on basically an annual basis in each one of these areas. Over the years that we've done predator management here in Alaska, we found out that bear control is not really effective, not compared to wolf control. Wolf control can be very effective with regard to moose and caribou populations, but bear control, not so much. The other aspect of this predator control is because of the state constitution and the statutes themselves, we are never authorized to exterminate any predator population in any area. We can reduce it temporarily, but we can never exterminate a predator population. Now, one of the questions that I was asked to address here was, why allow grizzly bear hunting? what are some of the reasons we allow it here in Alaska and you might consider down there in Montana? Well, one of the first and probably the most primordial way to justify it is for food and clothing for humans. If there is a viable resource out there that people need to feed their families or to clothe themselves, yeah, we should authorize a sustainable harvest of that. And here in Alaska, we do have villages that rely on wild meat exclusively, well, almost exclusively, but they still eat grizzly bear meat. They still use the hides for a lot of different things. And we have special hunts specifically for subsistence purposes here in Alaska of grizzly bears. Another reason you may authorize a hunt is for spiritual or ceremonial purposes. As I'm sure you're aware, and throughout not just North America, but the northern part of this world, the grizzly bear is a very iconic species. It's a very spiritual species. It's basically a liaison between the spirit world and our corporal world. And the way you respect that animal will reflect the way that the entire environment will reflect back on you. So you can look at a hunt as a way to utilize an animal in a spiritual way. The Ainu people of Hokkaido, Japan have this very complex way of ritualizing the bear, killing the bear, and releasing its spirit to go back into the bear world and tell folks about it. On a more utilitarian standpoint, some people believe that if a resource is provided to you, you have an obligation to manage it and use it. And that says if you've got enough bears out there to use, why not use it? So that's a bit of a ceremonial and spiritual aspect too. A third reason to possibly manage bears, hunt bears, is for population management. You know, Garth mentioned earlier that can bear populations be managed by hunting? Well, if you have enough hunting, yes, we do manage bear populations by hunting here in Alaska. We do it for the predator control, as I mentioned, or here on Kodiak, we do it for trophy size. Populations can be managed with hunting if you use enough of it. You can alter their bear behavior somewhat. I'll get into that later, but yeah, hunting can be used for population management if you do enough of it. A fourth reason would be predator control. I addressed that already a bit. Fifth reason could be to protect human life, livestock, or crop safety. Now, this is a lot more tricky, as Garth mentioned. You'd have to have very targeted hunts for the most part to stop the individual bear that's causing a lot of the problems. That's the reason why predator control in general doesn't work as well for bears as it does for wolves, because you could have a bear population of, say, 10 bears. There may be 2 of those bears that have gotten really good at killing calves, and the other 8 don't give a darn. They eat mostly squirrels or vegetation or things like that. Well, if you go predator control and you kill 7 bears out of that, you may or may not get those 2 that are the problem bears. So that's a bit of the concern about using bear hunting as a way to make people or crops or livestock more safe. Another reason possibly have a hunting season is tradition. A lot of people have a hunting tradition. They went hunting with their dad or their mom, and they're out there and they want to pass that on. And it may be for elk, it may be for bears. It's a traditional way of passing on knowledge and just bonding with each other. There are also folks that want to revitalize the idea of being a mountain man and going out and getting a grizzly bear. That may be the reason that they want to go out there. Or again, there are traditional indigenous folks that say, this is how people did it in the past, and we want to teach our folks, our younger folks, to continue those traditions, to be respectful of the animal, but also to harvest the animal and utilize every piece of it. And oftentimes, especially in indigenous cultures, well, any culture, the more you can be grounded in tradition, the less likely you are to be tempted by things like alcohol or drugs or other nastiness. Another reason possibly for hunting is recreation. A lot of hunters go out just to enjoy the outdoors, just to understand nature better. And that works just as well with a 30-06 as it does with a camera. But recreation is a legitimate reason why hunting could be allowed. Another opportunity would be for economic opportunity. Guides and outfitters here in Alaska make their living on taking bear hunters out. Here in Kodiak, a bear hunt for a non-resident hunter A guide charges up to $30,000 for the opportunity to take one of those animals. Landowners could make money off of hunts if they charge people to come onto their lands to take an animal. Taxidermists, of course, can make money. Agencies can make money too. You know, we heard earlier that Montana won't make very much money off of this because it's so limited in scope. But here in Alaska, where we kill about 1,500 grizzly bears, grizzly brown bears a year, and a lot more people come up for those hunts, it's a pretty big part of our agency's financial aspect. About 80% of the money that comes into Alaska Department of Fish and Game comes from non-resident hunters, not just for bears, but for other species up here. So agencies can make money off of it. And in some places, the selling of bear parts, you can make money, skulls, hides. We don't allow the sale of gallbladders at any point. And the last and perhaps the most controversial reason for allowing bear hunts would be for trophy hunt or for bragging rights. You know, a lot of folks want to spend a lot of money to share that unique opportunity through their stories they tell others, or images, or taxidermy mounts. I mean, look at the amount of money that's bid for bighorn sheep in Montana for those types of hunts. And, you know, you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, primarily for trophy hunts and bragging rights for the people. And a lot of those folks that want those bragging rights are also honestly concerned about conservation when they spend that kind of money. So another aspect of this is a little bit of our history, and our history follows a lot of what Garth was saying here in Alaska. You know, before the Russians came here, when it was just the indigenous people, bears were killed for meat and pelts and also for traditional practices. In the mid 1700s, when the Russians, then the British, then the American fur traders came, bears were a fur species. Sea otters were the big thing, but grizzly bears were also a fur that they sold and made a little bit of money off of. In the territorial days, in the early to mid 1900s, we had the same statewide predator control that Garth talked about. A lot of poison, a lot of aerial shooting. Got to kill the bears because they're a competitor for salmon, or they're a competitor for moose, or things like that. Statehood from 1959 until about the 1990s, a lot of research occurred around here, and we had very conservative regulations in an effort to rebuild our bear populations. Since about the 1990s to the current day, we have area-specific management programs. Some of those places have continued with the conservative types of hunts. Others have liberalized because we've seen that bears can tolerate a lot more harvest than we thought they did. And of course, the research has continued. So with that in mind, looking at how we manage hunts, again, we're a diverse state. We have a lot of different habitats, a lot of different areas, not a whole lot of access to where we go. So we manage our hunts with a whole list of different types of techniques. And in my notes there on your website, you can find each one of these. But basically what we're looking at is we want to collect information from the hunter and from the animal that's killed. Every bear that's killed and every hunter that goes after those is a source of data for us to use so that we can make sure that this hunt is sustainable, so that we can get a better idea of what the population is doing. Because as you guys know better than anybody, it's tough to know exactly how many bears are out there, even when you have a lot of biologists and a lot of radio collars. And it's even tougher to figure it out when you're a place like Alaska. So those harvest data help us get a window into what's going on with the bear population. We have different types of hunts in different areas. Some of Alaska is just a general season. All you have to do is have a hunting license and you can go out and go hunt bears. Other areas you have to register, and we have a limited number, but an unlimited number of permits. And then in places, for instance, like Kodiak here, we have lottery hunts, we have drawing hunts. In some of our areas, you have less than a 1% chance of being drawn for a bear hunt here. Our season lengths vary from being year-round in some areas to only being a few weeks long. Again, it depends on your management paradigm. Virtually every bear that's killed here in Alaska has to be inspected by someone in Alaska Department of Fish and Game. They measure the skull, they pull a premolar tooth to find out how old it is. They look at the hide and the hide quality, and they talk to the hunter about how things were during their hunt. And the bear is sealed with a CITES seal to say it was legally taken Alaskan bear. The only exception to this are those subsistence hunts I talked earlier. With subsistence hunts, you have to salvage the meat, but you do not have to salvage the skull. You do not have to salvage the hide. You do not even have to seal it, because in our indigenous cultures, it's disrespectful to take the skull out of the field. You leave the skull in the field, you face it to the east, you say thank you to the bear for giving itself to you, and you go on your way and hopefully are at peace with the bear's spirits. If you have to take that skull in to get it sealed, that kind of disrupts that a little bit. As far as bag limits are concerned, most of the state is one bear every 4 years. That's the way it was statewide until we started liberalizing things about 15 years ago. A lot of the interior grizzlies are now one bear per year that you can take. It's because there's a lot less access there, and those bears tend to be more predatory on the moose and caribou. And in some areas, we allow 2 bears per year, 2 grizzly bears per year to be taken by Alaska residents. Those are places that have even less access. And when you have a 2 bear bag limit, that automatically allows you to sell the hide or the skull if you want to. So that's an economic opportunity for some of those more remote villages as well. Everywhere in the state, cubs and sows accompanied by cubs are completely protected. Initially, we just said that sows accompanied by cubs were protected, and some disrespectful folks figured that out, so they killed the cubs first because they weren't protected. And the female was without a cub at that point, and they killed the female. So that's why we had to say cubs or sows accompanied by cubs. And a cub to us is a grizzly bear that it's in its 1st or 2nd year of life. We have a resident bear tag that costs $25. It's one of the only species that you have to have a resident tag for in Alaska. The other one is muskox. In several areas of the state, we've rescinded that $25 tag so that Alaska residents don't even need to have a tag when they go out there. That's primarily in the interior or the grizzly bear type of country. If you're a non-resident, in other words, you're from another state, you have to pay $1,000 for that tag. If you're from another country, you have to pay $1,300 for that tag. In both of those cases, if you're not an Alaska resident, you have to hire a registered guide outfitter. And all of our guide outfitters and our transporters are licensed and regulated by another board, the Big Game Commercial Services Board, to make sure they abide by the rules and provide a safe service for the folks that are coming up here. Nowhere in Alaska can you hunt grizzly bears the same day you've been flying. You cannot use any radio communication. You cannot use dogs. You cannot use artificial lights. You cannot herd or chase the bears. You cannot shoot them when they're in the den. You can't use rimfire cartridges like 22. Not that anybody'd be dumb enough to try to use that, but some folks, you never know. And you're never allowed to use poisons here in Alaska. Grizzly bear baiting is generally prohibited. However, there are certain places where we do allow it over black bear bait stations, and those again are closely regulated. Trapping is not allowed except in very rare certain areas that we try with predator control. And quite frankly, that was tried about 10, 15 years ago, and it didn't turn out so well. So I don't know if we'll ever allow trapping of grizzlies by lake hole traps again. So in summary, Alaska is a big and diverse state. We've got a very healthy population of brown grizzly bears, and we have intact ecosystems. Bear hunting is sustainable, and it's an integral part of our wildlife conservation program here. And it's evolved into a diverse management paradigm to match the goals and objectives in various parts of the state. We engage the public, we use the best scientific information possible, and we try to incorporate both consumptive and non-consumptive uses of bears and figure out ways we can coexist. So with that being said, just a couple notes that I put down here while I was listening to our other presenters. One of the questions was asked, can bear populations be managed by hunting? In situations like Garth described, he's exactly right. With such low harvest rates, it's really tough to have a big influence on bear populations, I believe. In situations like we have here in Alaska, yes, we do feel that we're managing bear populations. In fact, that's what I did my PhD on, was how to manage bear populations here in Kodiak for trophy-sized bears, as well as reducing conflicts right along the places where we have cattle ranches on the island. Can hunting be used to reduce conflicts? Yes, in specific areas, you can do that. If you have, for instance, very targeted hunts at an individual animal, and as was brought up before, that's not really fair chase anymore. That's trying to kill a specific animal. Do you allow a hunter to do that who's gone through a master hunter program? Yeah, some places we allow that. Or do you have an agency person do it? The bear doesn't care who kills it, but it is a possible way to reduce conflicts. Can you reduce conflicts in bigger areas? Yeah, you can, but again, you need to have fairly high harvest rates to do that. Here on Kodiak, the northeast part of the island has cattle ranches and most of our people. We have liberal bear seasons here. We do see reduced number of bears. We do see reduced conflicts with the cattle ranchers, and we do see bears tend to be more nocturnal around here than anywhere else on the archipelago. But again, you need to have fairly high harvest rates to achieve something like that. Can you reduce conflicts in the backcountry by hunting? Probably not. I think the vast majority of backcountry conflicts are not caused because bears are less wary of people. I think it's caused because bears are defending themselves. It's more of a surprise encounter type of thing. And finally, the question was, does hunting make people more tolerant of bears? Again, that depends on a person's personal feelings. In a place, for instance, in Kodiak, which again is not necessarily analogous to what you're dealing with in Montana, yeah, people are very tolerant of bears here in Kodiak because you think Kodiak, you think bear. It's iconic. So people don't want to just shoot bears willy-nilly around here. It's not accepted. If somebody poaches a bear on Kodiak, you find out pretty darn quick. It's also an economic resource because of the hunt. People recognize that that bear is worth potentially $30,000 to their neighbor who's a guide, and that guide is the same person that provides money for the basketball's fundraiser, and so forth and so on. And finally, if there's bear problems here in town, for instance, folks are more tolerant because they know that if they wait just a few more weeks, they can harvest that bear and keep it themselves because of our liberal seasons. So yeah, you can make people a little more tolerant of bears by allowing hunting in certain specific instances. So last, but I think not least, as I wrap this up, what I always try to tell folks when I talk about bears, either in a bear safety presentation or a management presentation or whatever, the critters we're dealing with here are incredibly intelligent, probably somewhere between a dog and a primate in their level of intelligence. When you have that level of intelligence, you're going to end up having personalities. You're going to have gangbanger bears, you're going to have rocket science bears. And when you try to generalize about what a bear is going to do or how it's going to react to hunting seasons or other things, you have to recognize that they learn and they have their own personalities. The other thing you have to accept and recognize is these critters are amazingly adaptable. There are viable bear populations in the Gobi Desert. There are viable bear populations in the rainforests of British Columbia, in the tundra of northern Alaska, now in the prairies of Montana. So to think that these are only animals that live in the mountains or live in the forests, I know all of you don't think that because you've got a lot of education, a lot of experience, but the general public may not recognize how adaptable these critters are. And they can learn because they're intelligent. They can adapt because of the way that God created them. So that's always something that I try to keep in the back of my mind when I generalize about these critters. Okay, well, thank you, Heather. I talked a little bit longer than I should. I see you've got my notes in your website. You also have our Board of Game findings, which is kind of our directive on how we do the regulations. And I think you have the Kodiak Bear Management Plan that we put together in a program similar to what you're doing. So thank you, appreciate it.
Thanks, Larry. Yes, all those documents are on the public website and have been sent to the council members. So thank you for sharing those, and thank you for a very thoughtful and informative presentation. I will open it up to questions from the council. And council members, if you do have a question, if you want to just raise your hand and turn your video on, we can we can order it that way. And in addition, just want to thank the public for streaming in and listening in to these presentations. Again, all of the presentations and supporting documents are on the website. And also Dylan Tabish is monitoring the engage and comment button, which is where you can, as public members, submit a question, and we'll try and take a couple of those here during this session as well. Erin.
Thanks. Sorry, I had to find all my buttons for unmuting myself. I just had a quick question going back to Ken's presentation, and this might be for Mark or Cecily even, in that data showing emergence. I'm just curious if that has been run with more recent data. I noticed that graph stopped, I think, with data from 1999. So if you just have any, if that's been re-looked at since then. And this is in regards to den emergence and timing.
I'll speak up quickly. That data was from, I think you're right, it's 75 through 99, and that was published in 2002. And we are participating in a project with Cecily and Lori Roberts, looking at den emergence and entry using our GPS data, more recent GPS data. So it is being looked at. Cecily might know better where we're at on that. Lori's been kind of taking the lead on that.
Cecily, do you have anything to add to that?
Sorry, I had trouble unmuting. Yeah, we are currently working on some analyses of grizzly bear denning chronology that we are estimating using activity data from the GPS collars. So it's not really finished yet, but it is something that we hope we'll have published in the next year and a half.
Thanks, Cecily. Brett.
Thanks. I had a question for Larry, and I should have wrote it down because now I forgot what it was. But I did have a question for Ken, and that was for the season settings for grizzly bears. Currently, with elk and deer, we do a season setting every 2 years. Is that something that with grizzly bears, if we were to enact that, is that something that we would do every year?
Yeah, because of the quota numbers, it'd be different every year. At least the quota part would be an annual visit. The structure, what we tend to do is the structure is every other year. I would guess with grizzly bears, just being as high profile it is, we would probably start on a year-to-year basis, and then if it looks like it's pretty stable, then go to an every other year on the structure. But the quotas, the numbers would be every year.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Ken.
I'll try to remember what I was going to ask Larry.
When you do, just re-raise your hand, Brett.
Thank you.
Robin.
Okay. Yeah. Yep. Got to find all my buttons too. Excuse me for being a little dense here, but as I'm listening to all of these presentations, for the state of Montana, and I guess, Ken, this is for you, what is the purpose and need for a grizzly bear hunt? I need to have a better understanding of what it is that we're trying to get at to create the hunt.
You're on mute, Ken.
Ultimately, it's for opportunity. It's similar to what you heard with Alaska. There's, a population with a sustainable resource that could sustain hunting. There's a component of our population that's interested in hunting. And so there's a potential opportunity to allow that. You know, whether that happens or not is, again, is a social question.
And Heather, could I have a follow-up or should I wait for another turn?
Sure, go ahead.
So then I guess one of the questions that I'm grappling with, and, you know, trying to, you know, because I have a lot of thoughts about this, which I've shared with some of my council members. So based on what we've heard from the other presenters, as well as you, Ken, today, we're not really sure if I heard this correctly, populations can be controlled, you know, as far as management, you know, of the bodies of the bears, which I know that's what the state does with our hunting season for deer and elk and, you know, our other populations, right? So I just wonder if there's, I'm just going to throw this question out there, and this is probably a discussion question as we move through the process. It seems like there's some other opportunities with how we manage bears now that are problem bears or that could be used without going into a hunting season through wildlife services that could work with those population pieces. I don't know if you can answer that today, but that's certainly something that I'm wondering about. If we don't have to, you know, I struggle with supporting hunting, but I know that there's other options through the wildlife services work that we could reach some of the goals that the state might need for managing the bodies of the bears.
Yeah, so I mean, that's what's happening now is management that is occurring is happening through wildlife services, through our bear specialists who, you know, respond to different conflicts and then, you know, make decisions on moving a bear, removing a bear, or doing nothing. So yeah, I mean, there's mechanisms in place, and just like you heard in BC, whether they had hunting or not hunting, they're still dealing with conflicts. They're still managing populations, things like that. You know, one thing, kind of back to your previous question, you know, specific to Yellowstone and the way that structure was set up is the bears that we count and the bears that get removed that are counted are pretty much it's those bears in the demographic monitoring area. So this gets back to one of our other topics of discussion, which was distribution. You know, if there was a recommendation or a direction of, you know, we don't want bears in eastern Montana, you could achieve that with the hunting. So you could, you know, manage portions of populations through hunting. All this assumes they're no longer on the endangered species list. Versus, you know, what we've agreed to in the demographic monitoring area where you have really tight sideboards. And again, those are all questions and issues that we're grappling with and you're grappling with.
I think that's really the heart of this whole conversation and reason for presentation, Robin. You're really getting at it is, what would the role of hunting be? And that's, you know, to give perspective within the state of Montana was Ken's presentation. Alaska provides another view and BC provides another view. And so we were trying to just share different perspectives and how hunts are or aren't used. So thanks for that question. There are a number of hands raised. Craig, I see yours raised. Was that in relation to Robin's question?
Yeah, I was just gonna provide some information from Wildlife Services perspective on Wildlife Services is about trying to manage conflicts or manage damage, and like Larry had mentioned in his presentation, predator control or population management through Wildlife Services on grizzly bears wouldn't likely happen. That wouldn't be a role that Wildlife Services would play. We wouldn't fulfill, I guess, the I'm trying to think of the verbiage that Robin used, the body management for that. So I wanted to make that clear to the council.
Thanks, Craig. Michelle.
Hi there. Yeah, I have a couple questions for Ken to start. First off, I would at some point like to hear the tribal perspective about hunting here in Montana, which Ken can't answer. But I also wonder about the Montana grizzly bear policy. Should bears be delisted? I'm asking about ARM 12.9.103, which calls hunting the most desirable method to minimize depredations and attacks on humans. I'm wondering about that wording, most desirable method. I'm not sure if that's really following science. I also question ARM 12.9.401 because it talks about opportunities shall include sport hunting. Does that mean if bears are delisted, the state will be compelled by law to have a hunt? I also would like to know about the monitoring in the DMA and outside of the DMA. So kills by hunting outside the DMA and poaching outside the DMA are not counted towards the total take, correct? So, because I know, and especially in other states, I know Wyoming was pretty liberal about outside the DMA hunting numbers. So that won't count to the next year's take, correct? Like
That's correct.
So you could kill a lot of bears outside of the DMA and it wouldn't be taken away from the count, the allowed hunting the next year?
That's correct. The way the structure is set up is those bears outside the DMA don't count for you. They don't count towards the population estimate. The mortalities don't count against the mortality limits. Right now, there's very few bears outside the DMA. And then our proposed structure for Yellowstone, at least, incorporated limits for the DMA to both inside and outside. So just to avoid the perception of what you were talking about. In terms of those rules, those are rules that are in place, administrative rules that identify a commission policy on grizzly bears. And so that's a commission policy. It would be up to the commission if they wanted to change those rules or change that to go in and modify that policy.
Thanks, Ken. Caroline.
Hi. Well, first off, I just wanted to thank Garth and Larry. That was really interesting, and I learned a lot about BC and Alaska. And then Ken, looking at that, it's kind of a long question. Alaska and BC have kind of full population. I mean, they are fully populated. I mean, they've got a bear population throughout the province and state, which puts them in a different position than we find ourselves, because that's not the case in Montana. And we've got these distinct populations. And I understand that we had to come up with the hunting regime as part of the GYE delisting. But how does that then, and that it would look somewhat like that with the NCDE as it moves forward to delisting. But how are we going to look at hunting statewide, kind of bringing up what Michelle was talking about with outside these DMAs and the kind of what you brought up too, kind of what does distribution statewide look like? How are we going to look at hunting when we have our recovery areas, we have our populations, we have DMAs, but then we have potentially this goal of a connected population? How is that going to affect our approach to hunting? And do we just need to wait a bit until, which we already did, which I think is super wise of Fish, Wildlife and Parks. But we have so many questions at play around these are recovery areas, whether or not we're talking about connectivity, and how do we then approach hunting in a much more holistic way rather than as our populations go through the delisting process. Does that make sense? I'm sorry, that's a very convoluted question.
Yeah, no, I get it. And that's exactly what we're struggling with as well, which is part of the reason for you guys in this council, and part of the reason for Rich Harris to try and move away from a population here and a population there approach to a bigger statewide approach that isn't, this is what we do in the Yellowstone and this is what we do in the NCD, but this is how we're going to manage bears in this part of Montana. And so then hunting again is one tool. There's, and then it maybe you can have connectivity in hunting both, depending how you structure it and where you place it and all of that. So it's just a tool that's there. There's obviously it's a high profile tool on both sides of the issue. And so again, that's why the approach so far has been, we can put together the biological basis and the structure of a hunting season and that, but ultimately it becomes a social issue, and how that gets addressed is, is the part that we look to the commission and the commission process to help guide us, as well as, you guys in this process. I don't know if that helped you or not.
I think that's what we're struggling with, is that we're just not quite there yet.
Yeah. And that the one other thing that, whether people like it or not, that's out there is the political side of this whole discussion, and concerns about if we're not addressing issues, or the legislature doesn't think we're addressing it well, it can get legislated. And so that's another concern. So as an example, we had a discussion a couple years ago with some groups that wanted us to declare a no hunting zone, basically that connectivity area is a no hunting zone. And my real concern is, if we overtly did that, the legislature would declare it something else, and then we will have lost our opportunity to responsibly manage. And so we got to think about, what are the consequences of different decisions as well from a political standpoint, which nobody likes to admit, but it's a reality we got to deal with.
And I think we've got two ends of that spectrum that we've got to deal with too. So yeah, I think that's why that's part of the reason why we're all really struggling with this. But again, I'm so appreciative of what we've learned today. So thanks.
Good.
Well, and having the framework to put that understanding and continuing to learn about that and understand what decision consequences have. Brett.
Yeah, and I see Dylan's got his hand up. I don't know if he has something important to say.
He's got some public questions to share. So we can start with your question and then go to Dylan.
Got it. Okay. I remember my question to Larry, and I have some other questions for Ken. So before I move on, Ken's with us every time. So thank you for being here. But definitely, I want to just express the thanks for Garth and Larry joining us. I really, really appreciate your perspective and your knowledge, and thanks for being here. Thanks for thanks for taking your time today to be with us. And so Larry, how long did it take your advisory committee to come up with that 202-page document?
Yeah, thank you, Brett. I appreciate that question. It was about 3 months, 3-4 months to do that. And
wow.
Again, it was a program real similar to what you're doing. You basically brought in a bunch of different experts, quote unquote, and let the real people figure out something. The amazing thing was that it all was by consensus. We were able to not have any minority views in the end. So, and in the past 20 years, it's been a living document. It's been used quite a bit. So, you know, I think what you guys are doing is very, very worthwhile, because it's much better to hear from the real people than it is from the agency experts.
And what you're referring to is the Kodiak Bear Management Plan,
That's
which
correct.
is also posted on the website. Yeah.
And if I just may add one more thing, Brett, if there's anything that I can help you with, or any questions you have after we're done here, I'm more than willing. I'm sure Garth is too, to answer by email or phone calls or whatever. So just keep that in mind.
Thank you.
I'm sure we'll be in touch. And Ken, so I just want to make sure that I understand, even if we, as a council, think that hunting it should be included as a management tool, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be hunting grizzly bears each and every year, or that it may even come up.
Yeah, that's correct. Ultimately, that's going to be a, department recommendation to the commission, and really it's a commission decision. So this 2018 was a good example where we presented the information that says, yeah, we could have a hunt. The commission made the decision that, at this point, no, we're not going to have a hunt. So ultimately it's a commission process, and that process is it's a very open public process. Typically if there's a proposal that they adopt, they put that out for public comment. And then 2 months later, we revisit and they make a final decision.
Okay, thanks. I think that'll help. I've been reading a lot of the public comments, and that's seems to think that we're going to just open this up, and I just wanted to make sure that that's not the case. That we are looking at this seriously and trying to consider it, and trying to make sure that the people that are managing grizzly bears have all the tools in the toolbox to be able to accomplish what it is that they need to accomplish.
Yep.
The other question is the DMA. It is, and I realize, and it's kind of struggling to some of us, I think, on the council, that we have grizzly bears that are outside that zone that are not being counted. And can we make a recommendation that be expanded or changed? And would it be well, first of all, can we do that?
Sure. You guys, you guys can, based on what you're hearing and what you're learning, is you can make recommendations that you think would help us in Montana manage grizzly bears more. I think one of the major reasons that, at least for the DMA and these are the ones we count and don't count, is just cost and ability, capacity to do that. As bears spread out further and further into more marginal habitat, the ability to count them consistently and regularly becomes more and more difficult. And so, and I'll look to Cecily or Mark to chime in, but and even if you look at the map, the overwhelming number of bears are in that DMA, and the ones that are out are not in the DMA. It doesn't mean we're not monitoring distribution and stuff. It just means they don't count in those formulas against us, or for us, or against us. So Cecily or Mark, is there more to add?
I think you hit the nail on the head. Is a lot of it's cost. We went from a population that was, inhabiting 25,000 square kilometers in the GYE to now our distribution estimate is 68,000 square kilometers. And the DMA, where we've committed to try to monitor and estimate population size and evaluate mortality, that's 50,000 square kilometers. And, it comes down to money and personnel to be able to do that. And we kind of bit the bullet and said, well, we think we can do it inside the DMA, but we can't be all places at all times in the GYE. So some of that stuff outside falls to the states. and how they want to do it. And like you did mention, we are documenting occurrences outside the DMA when they come to us, but we don't have any systematic surveys outside.
Okay. I know a lot of our ranch over by Red Lodge is outside of that. And then so I know that at least, it's kind of a two-edged sword on our half is that if we do have a problem bear, it doesn't really necessarily go against the count. But still, it's kind of frustrating that we know that there's bears there, but they're not being counted. And so that it's kind of a frustration, I guess, a little bit.
One other thing I would add is that, as a study team in the GYE, we felt that, monitoring the bears in the demographic monitoring area, we were monitoring basically a source or a core population, which would provide for expansion outside of that DMA. And, that's pretty much what we've been seeing.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Brett, for your questions. We'll take one from the public. So Dylan, do you want to share one?
Yes. So this is Dylan Tabish with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and I'm monitoring the website right now. So anybody out there who's watching and you'd like to submit a question or a comment, you can do so by clicking on that engage and comment button right there underneath the video. And I am monitoring those. And I've got two quick questions, one of them for Ken and another one for Larry. But also just as a reminder or not a reminder, but an announcement to everybody, all the public comment, a collection of all the input you've been receiving is now posted on the website for you to kind of better have collected and organized, but also for the public to see the types of input we're getting. We'll continue to update that throughout this process, roughly, every couple weeks or as we get input. So that is now on the website. Underneath links and resources, there's a public input section. Ken, the first two questions are for you. The first one's from Keith Kubista. Could you clarify, Ken, that you said all removals are considered mortalities? So if bears are removed from an area for augmentation, does that limit the sending area from having a hunting season?
Yeah, so under the structures that are set up for both NCDE and Yellowstone, a bear that's removed from the population, whether it's alive and moved to the cabinet yak or dead because it got hit by a train, that's a removal. So that counts like a transplant counts like a mortality if it's moved out of the ecosystem, and therefore would be, in those examples numbers I gave you, there'd be one less potentially available to hunt.
Okay, thank you. The next question didn't have a name attached to it, but the question was, how would the states ensure that a hunt, if enacted, would not impact the potential for grizzly bear populations to connect with each other and to recolonize the Bitterroot recovery area?
Well, a big part of it is just the very conservative structure of the season, or the format or the framework, so that you're not, driving numbers way down. The other is, or potentially could be, again, depending how that's implemented, through different management units and quotas and hunting structure within that management unit. So in that example I gave in the handout, we're within the Yellowstone DPS, we had a management unit on the west end and a management unit on the east end, both that would be closed to bear hunting under that proposal. And part of that reason would be to allow some of that connectivity going around on the either side of the DPS.
Okay. And then I got a quick one at the buzzer here for another one for you, Ken, that just came in from Claudia Narcisco. Regarding the DMA, it is not difficult to count a dead bear. If can't afford to count or monitor, not good, but money talks, but easy to count dead bears as long as that is part of the process. Why not require it? If that makes sense.
Not really. So she's asking, why not require counting bears? outside the DMA?
I think so.
Okay. I mean, if we know about them, we count them in the sense of we keep records of that and track that. They just don't count against those mortality thresholds. So any bears we know about, whether it's a live one on Brett's ranch or a dead one on the highway outside the DMA, is still noted and tracked. It's just not part of the annual population estimate and the annual mortality tallies.
Thank you. And so I can hold this other question, Heather, if you want to kick it back to the council.
I'll kick it back to the council, and there we've got a number of hands raised. And so I'm going to go to folks that haven't had a chance to ask a question yet. So Trina, I think you were before Cameron.
Oh, that's bright. There you go. Okay, my question was more of a statement, and Kristen just addressed it on the chat too, but I texted Lauren Monroe and asked him to get on the call. But now Kristen just said in the chat that he's not able to talk because he isn't on the call. Lauren, are you there or not?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Hi.
Oh, okay, good.
So can you introduce yourself, Lauren?
Sorry about that. Sorry for not being on the call earlier. I was doing some bear stuff. My name is Lauren Monroe. I am one of the bear managers for the Blackfeet Reservation for the Blackfeet Fish and Wildlife Program.
Thanks,
so my question was, or whatever, was Michelle wants to know about the tribal perspective for hunting. And so I know we have Dale on here too, to give us that perspective. And so that's why I told Lauren to get on, so he can kind of explain how it works on the reservation with the hunting season and how the natives approach hunting grizzly bears.
Okay, yeah, for sure. So at this point in time, the Blackfeet tribe does not support hunting by members and non-members within the reservation. And that was the official statement, I think, from 2 years ago, and they put a statement out on it. And that's kind of what we're going off of right now. The council election's coming up, so things change, you know. But officially, that's what the official tribe statement on it. And they're not opposed to the delisting, of course. You know, I think it's coming from a point of having more say over the grizzly bears within the Blackfeet reservation itself.
Thanks, Lauren. I appreciate you sharing that. Dale, did you want to speak on behalf of Confederated Salish and Cooney tribes? I'm not sure if Dale is still with us. Dale, if you're here, you can chat me and we'll bring you on. And in the meantime, just for the sake of time, we'll move to Cameron's question.
Yeah, so can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I guess the question is for Ken, and I just wanted to, I guess, get clarification. The bears outside of the DMA are not counted in the mortality limit, but given the structure of the season that's been proposed, that say that we took the numbers you had, there would be 6 males and potentially 1 female. If all of those bears were killed outside of the DMA, they would still count towards that quota.
Right.
And so you're not going to be killing all the bears outside the DMA uncontrollably. Is that accurate?
Right. And so, yeah, so when we say they count or don't count, it's against those, you know, the bears count towards the population estimate only if they're DMA. The mortalities count against the mortality thresholds only in the DMA. The way that structure was set up, the bear units include both in and out. So theoretically, you could take all of the bears could come out of or could come from the portion outside of the DMA, but we would still stop the hunt when we hit that limit of 6 in that example we gave.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, and I guess that, so there really realistically could be a lot more bears than 674 because they're not being counted outside the DMA. And
Right.
Yet if they get hunted outside the DMA, they still count towards the hunting quota.
Yeah, so they count towards the hunting quota if they're the way our structure is, if they're outside the DMA, they would not count towards the mortality limit for the year.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, Cameron. Nick. And again, folks, I see all the hands raised. I'm just trying to bring in voices that we haven't heard from yet, and then I'll circle back around.
Great. My question's for Larry. And Larry, what is the total take of brown bear in Alaska annually, roughly? And what percentage of the population does that represent? And then lastly, do you get a breakdown of males and females?
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Statewide, we harvest about 1,500 brown grizzly bears, and 1,500 out of 30 to 40,000 is, somebody do the math for me. It's not a great percentage there. We typically try to harvest at least 65% males. And what was the other part of the question, Nick? I forgot.
I think you just got it there. Is that a take of anywhere from 4 to 6% of the total population that you find?
Yeah, that's about right. 6% is what we aim for, and
as
it can go as high.
Ceiling.
I'm sorry, I stepped on you there. What did you say?
6% you said as sort of a ceiling, and
that is a target. Again, it depends on the area you're trying to manage for. Here in Kodiak, where we're managing for trophy species, we tend to go higher on the male rate. We're up around 75% males here because the males are the main predator on the cubs. So by killing more males, we actually have greater bear productivity in doing that. In areas, for instance, as I mentioned, the few areas that we try to reduce bear numbers to help moose or caribou, we'll try to aim at a higher female percentage in that. So again, one size doesn't fit all, but in general, it's about a 6% harvest rate we shoot for and about a 65% male rate.
And that's part of what I wanted to, I've read peer-reviewed papers out of Alaska that show that well-managed hunting, believe it or not, populations that were hunted had higher litter sizes and better cub survivorship. And that's because one of the big factors is male predation on cubs.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Dale, I see we've got you back online. Can't hear you though. Dale, just shoot a chat in the chat box when you might have your audio. I'll check back in after this next question. Kristen.
I actually had some questions, some follow-up questions for Lauren. The first one was, and kind of bear with me, my internet, I don't know what's going on, but I keep losing service. The first question I had is why, if he could explain why the Blackfeet tribe is opposed to a regular hunting season. And then I'll wait for the second question if you want to say.
Okay, hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so this is Lauren. From what I understand, the tribe is opposed to, I think, the hunting season, just because according to Blackfeet culture and our way of life and worldview is situated, it's kind of a taboo to eat bears and culturally to hunt them outside of like sustenance, and so we're kind of going off of that belief. But there's an asterisk to that because at the same time, according to Blackfoot culture, there are certain customs and ceremonies that allowed for that. So there is an asterisk for like quote unquote for hunting. So there might be a possibility if that was to be explored further. There are certain societies, Blackfoot societies, and beliefs that allow for certain things like that to take place. But that's, I believe, is one of the main reasons is not allowing for, non-members, to hunt them basically within, on the res anyway, I guess. Does that kind of answer your question, or?
Yeah, and I think you kind of followed up on it. So to clarify, like there's, and I'm gonna word this in my own words, and maybe you can correct me. But the management decisions for or against the hunting season are based on cultural beliefs, not necessarily the science, and based on a purely management decision. That doesn't sound, you know what I'm trying to say? There's other reasons besides just management.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Definitely cultural. For sure. When it comes to the Blackfoot culture, yeah, it's definitely, there's a lot of that plays into it, I think, for the decision,
And then I guess you kind of touched on the other thing I was going to ask, but so I do think there's a difference, and I'm glad we had the speaker from Alaska talk about some of their some of the background on the tribes up there and what they do. But we, gosh, I think there's a difference between a regular hunt and what we might consider taking a bear for ceremonial purposes, or a ceremonial hunt. And you kind of touched on that a little bit. So are you saying that there's possibility that the tribe would be in support of doing something like that, or continuing those beliefs or practices, to maybe not allow for a regular hunt, but to allow for a ceremonial hunt?
The conversation, oh, sorry. Yeah, the conversation has certainly come up for that, I think, for some of those practices to, I guess, continue. But I don't know if that's a set in stone or anything like that. It's definitely been, a possibility. But with the council elections coming up, I guess we'll see. But this is really, on my own. I guess there's a possibility, but I can't say that for sure.
And then my last question is, what is your perspective with managing grizzlies on the Blackfeet Reservation in regards to hunting, but how it applies to management in the state? Does it apply or does it not?
I think I understand what you're trying to say. I think the tribe's perspective for sure is to have more hands-on, I think, with some of the decisions, and, going off of the statement for the enlistment of it was made by our secretary from 2 years ago. It restores to the Blackfeet Nation a sovereign power to resume regulation of all game within our territory. And I think, kind of going from that mindset or that statement is to continue. I kind of pick up, I guess, where it left off with the Endangered Species Act, and having our own culture and understanding to play a factor in bear management. For one, obviously the Blackfoot relationship with the bears and how we traditionally managed them, since time immemorial, and having that relationship, having a more of a role in it, a cultural relationship, I guess.
So I'm just going to paraphrase, and you can correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but the perspective or the intent is for the tribe to continue to manage and conserve their resources within their boundaries as they choose to do so. And in regards to the state, does that apply at all, really? Because there's the reason I'm asking is this is the way I see it, there's been a lot of questions about tribal conservation and management for the tribes, and especially for with the role of hunting, and the way that my personal perspective is that it's based on, for the tribe, it's based on a cultural, on cultural beliefs. And it is not appropriate to impose those cultural beliefs on the entire state of Montana.
Oh, yeah, I see. I, as far as I can interpret it and things like that, I think that's like the case. Yeah, yeah, I think that's what's kind of going on. I think for the reservation within their boundaries, I mean, that's kind of how it would work from this area. But anything beyond that, that's I don't think they would set an expectation for others. You know what I mean?
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I'm aware of the time. I have a couple of things to share and sort of talk about how to continue this conversation. Before I go that direction, I do want to share from Dale Becker, who is the wildlife manager for Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, and his audio is not working. He's able to hear us, and he is responding, and I'll share his message from the chat box. He said, for CSKT, the tribes and cultural committees moved for the prohibiting of sport hunting on grizzly bears in the early 1980s, and that has been the position ever since due to the cultural and spiritual concerns. It may be revisited in the future, but I would expect strong opposition to any hunting proposal. There was a question that came up around cultural hunts, and Dale said they might be allowed, but only after substantial review and discussion by the elders, cultural committees, and tribal council. Generally, the elders have opposed taking animals unless the animal was used for food or subsistence. So that's Dale's response to tribal perspectives for the Confederated and Salish and Kootenai tribes. Again, aware of the time, again, want to apologize for the technical difficulties that took time from our discussion. Knew that this would be an important discussion. We haven't focused on the role of hunting yet until this time. And so knew that even with 3 hours dedicated, that we would want additional time to continue this conversation. And so what I want to propose to council members is in looking at the schedule moving forward, we have Friday, April 17th. And again, for the public, these dates and times are indicated up on the council website. Friday, April 17th from 9 to noon, we have another 3-hour Zoom meeting scheduled. The topic for that is social tolerance. That's been a conversation that you've all expressed wanting to continue to have, and specifically focusing on. We have Alex and Libby Metcalf that will join us for the first hour of that call. And Sean and I and Charlie were discussing about wanting to continue the social tolerance discussion and also continue the role of hunting discussion for those additional 2 hours on the 17th. Want to be really respectful of everyone's time today, and knowing that we're now 3 minutes past noon, and know that there are still more questions, and I think we could have several hours of more really helpful, informed discussion. And so does anyone, I think for ease sake, is anyone opposed to continuing the role of hunting discussion for council members on the 17th, as well as incorporating the social tolerance conversation on the 17th? Anyone have any objections to that? Okay, thanks everyone. There's some chats coming in saying that there's thumbs up for that. We also, and so there also might be some confusion because you did get invites from Charlie. We had to switch around the topic. So again, April 17th is social tolerance, and we'll continue the role of hunting. Friday, April 24th from 1 to 4, we'll be talking about livestock and agricultural compensation. That will also be a Zoom meeting. Both of those on the 17th and the 24th will have this YouTube live stream for the public. That YouTube link will come up the morning of, so the public can access and follow along as we've done today. We are still holding the dates of May 11th, 12th, and 13th for council meeting. It was slated for Red Lodge. We don't have information yet around whether or not that will happen in person. We would like for everyone to hold those dates regardless of whether it's in person or we use technology to continue conversation. And then we also have placeholder dates for June 8th and 9th. There was a lot of discussion in our meeting a couple of weeks ago of wanting to make sure that we could get the council up to Choteau and Browning for a meeting. And so depending upon the state of COVID-19, we're holding June 8th and 9th as placeholders. If we don't go up to Choteau and Browning because of the limitations in social gatherings, we'll likely use that time to get together and continue discussions, and again, make that available to the public. Want to thank Larry and Garth and Ken for your thoughtful and informative and detailed presentations. It seemed like there was a lot of information to digest. There's been a lot of thanks going on from the questions and on the chat box that people are very thankful, and this was helpful information. Sean or Charlie, is there anything that you want to add to this? Certainly want to thank Dale and Lauren for being present, and the entire support team for being present for questions. I know that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had an all staff meeting at noon, so they've had to sign off. And thank you to the public for bearing with us during this time. And I know we couldn't get to all of your questions and comments. Those are again available to the council members, and we'll do our best to address more of those in our next meeting on the 17th. Charlie.
I think Heather Martz, our director Williams, FWP, was in and out of the meeting listening. I know she's really following what this group is doing, and a lot else going on right now, as everybody can imagine with COVID. But I don't think she's. Oh, she's on. Well, there you go.
I've actually. Thanks, Charlie. I've actually been able to listen in to almost all of it. So just really appreciate everybody's efforts to figure out how to do this virtually. And it shows that the conversation's been really helpful, even if we're not in person. So appreciate that, and have been happy to listen in and not needing to add more, not yet. I do think, though, I guess I will say, I do think these conversations are valuable, and whether or not there's already direction on hunting, it is a part that I think we just need to be upfront about. And I really appreciate you considering it, because it's going to be fluid, and I think it's an important part of this discussion. So happy to have been able to at least listen in today.
Thanks for joining us, Martha.
Thank you.
And I know that we didn't get to everyone's questions from council, and I really appreciate the tone of the questions that have been coming in, being really thoughtful, being really respectful, and knowing that there are values to be taken into consideration and a lot of different opinions and experiences. So again, I really appreciate the thoughtfulness of the questions, and the questions really trying to help inform the conversation and trying to determine what those recommendations might be in this report. Charlie or Sean, is there anything else that you wanted to make sure that we touch on?
This is Sean. Nothing more from me, Heather. Just another word of thanks for our guest speakers and all of the council members for really diving into what's a very contentious topic and doing so in a really thoughtful way, and looking forward to continuing the conversation next week when we pick it back up.
Thank you.
Agreed on all those same.
Hey, Heather, do you mind putting a reminder about the kind of the framework that's on the website too for the public?
I'm sorry, can you say more, Dylan?
I guess I can mention it, that any members of the public who are wanting to follow along on this process, we have posted the first draft of this council's kind of separate group frameworks that they've been working on, and these are emphasis on draft. And that's posted under the March 2020 minutes section. And that will continue to be updated and evolve as these meetings go along. But that is kind of a starting point if members of the public want to see where this is at.
Thanks, Dylan. Well, thank you everyone for joining again. Great conversation. As Martha said, it's really a testament to everyone's engagement and involvement in being able to have this conversation via video as opposed to in person. I know that there was a lot of trepidation and concern about how difficult these conversations can be and wanting to do it in person. And I think you're really taking advantage of the technology, and I appreciate that. And I look forward to continuing the conversation on the 17th at 9 a.m. So thanks everyone, and we'll be in touch, and have a good rest of your day. Stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
I just let Missy know that the meeting's done, Charlie.
Thank you, Dylan.